the Senior Director of Energy in the National Security Council, and a person that has devoted his life to the problem of energy. To both of them, I want to ask you about the relationship between north and south of the hemisphere in terms of energy. 10 years ago, the idea was that you will have an energy cooperation between South America plus Mexico and the United States and Canada. The idea 10 years ago was that in the south, including Mexico, we will have an important surplus of oil for export. And that will be necessary to attend the growing deficit of energy in the United States. Today, 10 years later, the situation is quite the opposite. In the United States, we have had an outstanding performance that creates a new situation in which the United States will not be anymore a net importer, but perhaps a net exporter of oil. And in the South, the situation is going not well, I will say. We have a lot of difficulties. In Venezuela, it's so clear. Argentina, 10 years ago, was a net exporter of oil and gas. Today is an importer of oil and gas. I would say that in Ecuador, in spite of the quality of the resources, we have had a very small growth in the production. Of course, there are good news like Brazil, and there are some hopes with the energy reform in Mexico. My question is, which are in the next decade the prospect of this cooperation between the United States and Latin America? And second, if this new situation in which the United States become an exporter and Latin America reduce its contribution to the oil market, does mean that we will have a new geopolitics of energy in the hemisphere. And I want to offer the floor to Bill Richardson and Adam Sieminski. Please.
Well, thank you, Genaro. Thank you you articulated the issue very well. You know, you mentioned 12, 15 years ago, 10 years, I was Energy Secretary of the United States at a time when oil was $10 a barrel. There was no energy strategy. Renewable energy was kind of a thought out there. Shale gas, people kind of looked askance at it. But today, I think you have to look at, by natural causes, by the private sector and some government cooperation, the energy landscape in the United States, as you said, has changed dramatically. The shale gas revolution, some controversy over fracking, but the United States becoming probably, today it's the 10th largest, 10% of the world's oil comes from the US. Natural gas and oil production, energy efficiency, renewable energy, shale, have made the US probably the top producer in the next 3 years worldwide, even surpassing Saudi Arabia. Now, what does that mean within our hemisphere? And you asked specifically between North and South. I think if you look at the Mexican, the US, the Canadian market, you're seeing probably some of the largest concentrations of energy exports, energy production. And I'm not just talking about oil and natural gas. I think you're talking about shale, you're talking about renewable, a real potential block. You said, what are the prospects for energy cooperation? I think they're a lot better than they were in the last decade. Energy reform in Mexico, in my opinion, it's going to happen. I mean, I remember being here a year ago, oh, it's not going to happen, the politics, it's going to be diluted. It's passed the implementation of energy reform is passed. It's a reality, and it's not privatization. It's a partnership, and you're going to see, at least with Mexico and Canada and the U.S., offshore oil cooperation. You're going to see oil and gas. You're going to see shale. You're going to see, I think, fairly quickly, enormous investment potential. Now, Canada has also had a lot of discoveries, not just tar sand, shale. They're enormously active. There's almost been a revolution in Canada, too. So you've got three countries, Canada and the U.S. and Mexico, very much on the move with, all right, I think the jury's still out in Mexico, but I think the pessimists have been defeated because of a political alliance made in Mexico that enabled these reforms to happen. I know Pemex, has still got to work its way, but I'm optimistic that you're going to see a dramatically good movement. Now, the South. A lot of uncertainty, but I think some glimmers of hope. One, renewable energy has grown enormously in southern Latin America, the southern part. There's been dramatic advances in technology, private sector cooperation, transfer of technology. So renewable energy is moving very well. Brazil, ethanol, I mean, it's had its problems, but a revolution existed there that set an example for a lot of nations. Argentina, enormous potential for shale. Argentina has to deal with its political and economic problems, but there's a tremendous potential there. Colombia, new discoveries, new elections there. I think you're seeing some very good movement. Chile, your country, always private sector. I think you're seeing some very interesting public-private partnerships, especially in renewable energy and water. The Caribbean, I think also moving very rapidly on renewable energy, but at the same time, lacking the supplies, the assurance of supplies that are needed. Ecuador, enormous potential. We know that, but I think the political issues there need to be sorted out. I'll conclude with Venezuela. I think the good news about Venezuela is the people there, the private sector. I think there's potential for Venezuela to come back, but it's going through enormous turmoil. I would say the best word to explain what's happening in Venezuelan energy is uncertainty. Uncertainty a little bit on the negative side, because not just less production, but also the political uncertainty. So let me conclude with what are the prospects? That was your question. I'm an optimist. I was an optimist here a year ago when you asked me to speak about immigration. I was wrong. Michael Shifter mentioned, you're not talking about immigration. I said there would be an immigration bill by now, so don't take what I said very seriously. Again, I see with market reforms, with transfer of technology, with new discoveries, with energy cooperation, with the United States and Canada, and we're paying a little more attention. We should pay more attention to each other. I think Latin America needs to, let's stay within the hemisphere. It doesn't mean we don't look at other partnerships, China, Russia, but I think if we stay close as a region in energy, I think we're a lot better off. So that was not bad, 7 minutes.
Oh, yes. Please, Adam, I am asking for the same question.
Minister Arriagada, Secretary Richardson was both succinct and brilliant in his comments, and I'll try to not disappoint. Okay. So this segment's turned on and on again. working?
Push it up.
Let's try it again.
There you go, there you go.
Is-
Give it a second. There we go. All right, let's start over again. Mr. Arriagada, thank you. And Secretary Richardson, nice remarks, and I'm going to try to follow your lead and be brief. I'm heading up the Energy Information Administration at the Department of Energy. We do data and analysis on all kinds of things, and earlier this year, EIA published a report called Liquid Fuels and Natural Gas in the Americas. Let me just give you a couple of brief thoughts on what we found in that report. First of all, with growing production in a number of countries, including the U.S., of course, the Americas are a significant contributor to the global markets. We're actually rivaling the Middle East now in oil and rivaling the former Soviet Union in natural gas production. Even in biofuels, for example, Brazil and the U.S. taken together account for something like 75% of all biofuels production in the world. In the area of trade, things are really looking very strong. There's 6 million barrels a day of intra-American trade in crude oil. That's more than half of crude oil imports in the region are coming from within the region. 73% of oil exports from the region actually get consumed in the region. So 6 million barrels a day of oil, crude oil trade, 3 million barrels a day of oil products trade. Again, fairly strong numbers, something like 66% of total imports are coming from within the region. It is getting bigger, and it's very significant in terms of its global levels. In the natural gas area, because natural gas, at least until recently with the development of LNG, relies still largely on pipelines, and although there was a lot of pipeline trade between Canada and the United States, we're not seeing as much of that within the region, but even natural gas is growing, and with the expansion of the Panama Canal, which is coming up within the next year or so, we suspect that there will be greater exports of natural gas from the region in the form of liquefied natural gas. One of the other things that we found, and it's a very important one, and I'll conclude on this remark, is that in looking at all of these facts, growth in oil production, growth in natural gas production, growth in trade, what we have seen is an openness to outside investment in the oil and gas industry varies across the Americas. The recent trends have tended to be more positive. That is, we're seeing greater economic activity in those countries that have more open investment laws and regulations. And I think that what's been occurring in Mexico, for example, over the past few years with the energy reform is a very important aspect of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Francisco Monaldi. He's a professor at Harvard of energy policy, and at the same time is a person that has worked in Caracas, Venezuela, and has been a teacher in Colombia, Switzerland, Peru, and Venezuela. I want to ask to Francisco, let me say that one of the main concerns in Latin America, and I will say in the entire world of energy, is the situation in Venezuela, and especially the situation of oil. My impression, I want to be a provocateur, not an academician, is that every other day we receive news that are worse than the day before in terms of the situation of oil in Venezuela. My questions are two. First, which is the present situation of the industry in Venezuela? And second, if the situation can be improved, in what amount of time? Let me say, how long it will take the recovery of the production, let me say from 2 million barrels a day to, that is the present situation perhaps, and to 3.3 million barrels a day that was the production 10 years ago. How long it could take?
Well, thank you for the invitation. Let me put a little bit of what's happening in Venezuela in perspective in the region. You know, the last 10 years have witnessed the highest and longest period of highest prices, you know, in history. And so you would have expected in almost every single country an increase in oil production. And that's basically what we have seen generally. All the regions in the world had a significant increase in production in the last 10 years, except for Latin America, which basically stagnated. Of course, that average hides the big differences. The two countries that went down significantly were Venezuela and Mexico, and then Argentina, as you mentioned in the introduction, and the two countries that went significantly up were Brazil and Colombia. In fact, Colombia today is exporting almost as much oil as Mexico, which is amazing. This is, by the way, the only other countries in the world that had significant declines in production besides Mexico and Venezuela during this period are either because of geological reasons like the North Sea or because of major political upheaval like Libya or Iran sanctions. So in this context, Venezuela is in the region, the country that has the largest oil reserves. I mean, depending, you can discuss if it are the largest in the world or not, or whatever, but I mean, very significant reserves that could be either 60 or up to 90% of the reserves in the region. Despite all this favorable environment, Venezuela, as you mentioned, is in dire trouble. And I think, I mean, coming from the previous panel, my friend Mauricio Arriagada said that this time in Latin America we didn't have a party with that much alcohol. Well, in Venezuela we had a big party with a lot of alcohol and heavy drugs. And I mean, this is a country that in the year with the highest price of oil in history had a deficit of 20% of GDP in the public sector. It's a country that multiplied its debt by 5 times. We not only invited everybody to the party in the country, but we invited our friends in Cuba, in Dominican Republic, and in other countries to share the party. Well, of course, the bill, we have to pay the bill. So the situation, this is the context for the terrible situation of the Venezuelan oil industry. And so let me put some figures there. I mean, there has been, as you mentioned, a decline of about between 600,000 and 700,000 barrels in production. Exports have declined much more, about 1 million barrels, because the domestic market is growing like crazy. As you know, gasoline is free in Venezuela. You know, a barrel of oil, a barrel of gasoline in Venezuela is sold for less than $1. I mean, a barrel that costs more than $100. You know, so we are more than 20 times cheaper than Saudi Arabia in terms of the price of gasoline. And of course, consumption has skyrocketed, including smuggling to Colombia and other countries in the Caribbean. On top of that, so you have decline in production, decline in exports, increase in the domestic market, and we have then these agreements with other countries in the region in which we sell oil at a subsidized price, which also reduces the cash flow of the national oil company. We have then to fulfill these contracts with China that has loan money to the Venezuelan government, not to the oil company, but to the government, and has to be repaid by sending oil to China. So that further reduces the cash flow of PDVSA. And so PDVSA, in reality, is receiving about cash for about 1.6 million barrels of oil per day. And if you add to that all the social expenditures that PDVSA has to not only do itself, but also give money to a special fund that the government has total discretionary use over, basically PDVSA is in a dire cash flow situation that explains this continued decline in production. And because of the extremely over-appreciation of the exchange rate, PDVSA doesn't have even enough bolivars, the domestic currency, because it exchanged dollars for a very appreciated exchange rate. And as a result, the Central Bank of Venezuela is printing money like crazy to finance a national oil company, which is one of the craziest things that you could think about. I mean, it's 500 billion bolivars, which is, at a reasonable exchange rate would be about $20 billion in loans from the central bank to the national oil companies. The debt of PDVSA has increased from $3 billion 8 years ago to $45 billion. But that's a financial debt. If you add the arrears with suppliers, with partners, etc., you can add another $20 billion to that. So it's a very unsustainable and problematic path. If you add to that the fact that the mix of Venezuelan production is going from conventional, it's declining significantly. The conventional area in the Lake of Maracaibo that produced more than 1.5 million barrels of oil today is producing less than 750,000. The more productive area in the eastern part of Venezuela of conventional oil has peaked and it started to decline. So all the increase is in extra heavy oil. And that, as you know, it's a problem because it's harder to market. You either have to upgrade this oil because it's of very low quality, cannot be processed by refineries in the world, or you have to mix it with a lighter oil. And as I said, the lighter oil is going down, so you have to, Venezuela announced recently that it's going to import oil from Algeria because it needs to mix it in order to export the extra heavy, because the investments in the extra heavy upgrading have not happened. So the situation is really problematic, and moreover, in our, I mean, the most important market of Venezuela is still barely the U.S. We used to export about 1.7 million barrels 10 years ago. Now we are exporting about 700,000, so 1 million less. And this is still above what we export to China and to India, which are the other two big markets for Venezuelan oil. But the trends are very clear. And the problem is that the Canadians are basically taking all the Venezuelan market of heavy oil. Slowly but surely, the Canadian exports to the U.S. have increased, and this is even before Keystone is approved. That, I mean, I have been predicting, as Governor Richardson said, I have predicted every year that Keystone is going to be approved, and I always, so maybe I'm wrong, but I think it will be eventually approved, and that will bring more than 800,000 barrels of oil from the Canadian tar sands to the markets of Venezuelan and Mexican. By the way, Mexico is also going to be in deep trouble because of the cheap Canadian oil getting to the Gulf Coast, to the deep conversion refineries of the Gulf Coast. So going back to the prediction about what could happen in Venezuela, things can turn around relatively quickly, but in circumstances that are hard to believe that will happen soon, which are conditions of stability, credibility, a government that can provide some institutional credibility and that can make the national oil company PDVSA to fulfill some basic investment. So I think, I mean, because of the potential of the Orinoco Belt and the amazing reserves that Venezuela has, things can significantly change, but it will require a set of policies of infrastructure, of partnership with, I mean, Venezuela has signed deals with at least 7 different deals with major oil companies around the world to develop the Orinoco Belt, but nothing has happened in the last 5 years because of the lack of investment by PDVSA and because of the lack of clarity of the rules. So it's not like Venezuela is closed to the oil sector. It's just that because of credibility issues and the way the companies were expropriated and the lack of capacity of implementation of PDVSA, this is not happening. But I think we can, I mean, in less than a decade, go back to 3.3 million barrels and even further if the right conditions come.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, our next speaker is Mauricio Tolmasquim. He's president of Empresa de Pesquisa Energética, that is associated to the Brazil Ministry of Energy and Mines. He's a professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And I want to ask to Mauricio, let me say, being a provocateur, I think that in the field of energy does exist a golden rule that says in a country, the better the natural resources of oil, the worse the public policy of energy. And then I think that Brazil is a good example of this rule. Let me say that 20 years ago, Brazil was responsible of the 2/3 of the imports of oil of the entire Latin America. The situation of the natural resources was pretty bad, but the policy of energy was very good, and perhaps the best in Latin America. And because of that, we have had an outstanding performance in the area of energy in Brazil. In this year, Brazil has arrived at a situation in which is self-sufficient in terms of energy. And after the discovery of the pre-salt fields, the situation of the natural resource has become pretty good. But again, it's a suspicious, the golden rule. There are some people that are saying that today Brazil is changing its policy of energy for worse. It's true that the changes in the policy of energy are creating damage to the development of the oil sector in Brazil, or this is not true and is only a gossiping stimulated by the vested interest of the oil companies.
Okay, so thank you very much. Good question. You know, Brazil discovered oil in the pre-salt layer in 2007, and it's a very important amount of oil. The big challenge is that this oil is very far from the coast and in very deep waters. So only to give an idea, an helicopter, there is no autonomy to go from the coast to the platform. You have to build a place between the coast and the platform to the helicopter put fuel and go to the platform. So very big logistic. Fortunately, we have Petrobras that has the technology to exploit this oil in very deep water. I think that in the old, there is only, I say, Petrobras and maybe more 2 or 3 companies that can exploit oil so deeply. But anyway, this is, let's say, the challenge. The good side, the good side is that the risk of exploitation is very, very low. It means you make 20, you put exploit 20 place and you find almost 100% is a success. So there is a rule in the economics book that say lower is the risk, more is the take of the state. And more is the risk, biggest is the risk, more you have to give to the oil companies. What changed in Brazil is the perception of risk. The risk is very low. So it changed the rule to increase the part taken by the state. And we are going to use these resources to finance education and health. Why that? Because we are using let's say, a exhaustible resource, some affinity resource, something, and we have to let to the future generation something in a change. So it's why we changed the rule, but let's say, I don't, anyway, Brazil will be one of the biggest producers in 2020. We expect to be producing 5 million barrels per day. Nowadays, we produce 2.2 billions. barrels, and we are been exporting 1.5 million barrels per day. So Brazil will be a very important exported country. And I think the difference between Brazil and other oil exporting countries is that, say, Brazil find the oil after he industrialized all the economy. And the other oil import countries find oil before. So in the other imported countries, exported countries, there was, let's say, the oil cost, the evaluation of the currency and that impeached the industrialization. Brazil has a very complex and integrated industry. So the challenge in Brazil is avoid the oil costs, and I think that change the policy was necessary to guarantee the national content and guarantee that the oil sector will be, let's say, it will help the industry not to go against the national industry. So, at the same time, I would like to finish to say that Brazil has one of the most renewable energy metrics in the world. 41% of our energy metrics came from renewables. In the world, you know, only 13% came from renewables. And when you look to the electrical sector, the share of renewables are even bigger. 8% of the power sector is renewable, while in the world only 20% is renewable. So, and at the same time, you have the ethanol. So Brazil, will, I think, will be the first oil exporting country to have one of the more renewable energy metrics in the world. What I think is, in principle, seems to be contradictory, but I think that it was only possible because the oil came after the renewables, only now. So to answer a question, I think no, I think the policy is adequate for the risk that we have in this with the pre-salt layer.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, our next speaker is Ed Morse. Ed Morse is a global head of commodity research at Citigroup, and he has worked in different places, the Credit Suisse, Lehman Brothers. He served as director of international affairs at Phillips Petroleum Company. Ed is a person that can speak about oil, gas, any field of energy. I will reduce my question to the shale gas. In the center of the present energy revolution of the United States, the shale gas is so important. But the shale gas is not only in the United States. According to data released by the US government, we have a lot of shale gas in countries like Mexico and Argentina, very, very important, Mexico and Argentina. We have shale gas in Brazil, and even in Paraguay and in Chile. In Chile, those reports are talking of about 64 trillions of cubic feet of shale gas. To have an idea of that, in a moment, Bolivia has reserves of natural gas of 50 trillion cubic feet. Then, according to this data, Chile is plenty of gas, what I don't believe, but could be. My question to Ed Morse is, which is the outlook for the shale gas in Latin America? We will have an industry of shale gas in Mexico. What is happening with Vaca Muerta in Brazil, in Argentina? And from another perspective, it is true that most of the countries in Latin America are looking to buy shale gas in the United States, but not to produce that gas in their own countries. And finally, looking ahead, which will be the contribution of the shale gas to the energy matrix of the U.S. by the end of the next decade, let me say at the year 2030? Please, Ed.
Thanks. That's a short list of questions to deal with in 7 minutes. And let me make it more complicated by adding shale-related oil to the equation, because the two are part and parcel. And just to give the dimensionality of what's happened in the U.S., the U.S. has seen oil production increase by 70% in the last decade. If you look at the U.S. and Canada combined, oil production alone is up 4.5 million barrels a day. And as the professor just told us, the rest of the Americas, including Mexico, was basically even over the course of the decade. So it's a big difference, and it's having a huge impact. On the natural gas side, we produced virtually no gas from shales a decade ago when the revolutions started to emerge. We're just about 50% of the production today. So the U.S. has moved from 55 billion cubic feet a day producer to 70 billion cubic foot a day producer, and production keeps growing even though, and here's the stunning number, drilling for gas has declined by over 75% in 3 years, and production keeps growing, and the price doesn't go up as a result. So that's an indication of not just how prolific these rocks are, but the efficiency gains that are accumulated over time and how cheaper it gets to be. When it comes to oil, the U.S. produces 3.6 million barrels a day of shale oil. The rest of the world, about 700,000 barrels a day. 360 of that is in Canada, 150,000 a day in Russia, bits and pieces in Argentina. We expect on the oil side, between now and 2020, 2030 is a harder vision, but between now and 2020, U.S. Shale gas production to increase volumetrically so that the U.S. is going to be a 90 to 95 BCF a day producing country. That's another close to 30% increase in the base. More on a percentage basis will be coming from shale. And when it comes to oil, we think there'll be another 4.3 million barrels a day of oil by 2020, 3.5 million of that from shale oil and the rest from deep water. Those numbers are a little bit more robust than the ones Adam would provide. There's plenty of opportunities in Latin America. There are clearly big opportunities both in Argentina and in Mexico because of the hospitality of the government of both countries at the moment, although Argentina remains to be seen. But to give you the dimensions of the growth in Argentina from the Vaca Muerta, at the end of last year, Argentine oil production was about 500,000 barrels a day. And sometime by the end of this year or into the first quarter of next year, that would grow by 20%, maybe more than 20%. So 600,000 barrels a day. But in relationship to the resource base, that is an indication of how rapidly this can be developed in a country that has the infrastructure, has the transportation infrastructure, has the resource base, and has attracted capital from 15 major companies from around the world. So on that basis, you could expect Argentina, with the right kind of investment setting, which is not quite there, to not have 100,000 barrel a day per year growth, but a significantly higher growth per year based on the resource base of the Vaca Muerta. In Mexico, one could have projected between last year and 2018 a decline of 500,000 barrels a day of output. Without the reform, with the reform, the government is very conservatively, in my mind, projecting 500,000 barrels a day growth on the oil side, slightly lower growth on the gas side for complicated reasons. Mexico has become a very large importer of gas from the U.S., currently around 2.6 BCF a day. those data can't come from scrapes of pipelines. The EIA data lag behind that, so the EIA has a lower number than the pipeline data would lead you to believe. That's up from 1.9 BCF a day a year ago, 1 BCF a day the year before that. Mexico is becoming a very large importer of natural gas from the U.S. The prospects are there. What are the impediments? So the impediments are largely twofold in nature. One is, and I think this is as important as the other, one is that the fiscal regime in the U.S. and Canada is exceptional. And if you want to attract capital, the competition is capital going into the U.S. So the real revolution is one that impacts not just resource nationalism, and it is dramatically going to affect Brazil, by the way, because I think they got it wrong in terms of the competition for capital. When you can invest in whether deep water in the U.S. or onshore in the U.S., you need to match up a return from that elsewhere in the world, and the returns, other than recently in Colombia, are not very good. They probably will be good in Mexico, but getting the competition for capital right is hard. Russia is striving to get it right. Russia is a very large producer. It is trying to attract the same capital that would be going to Argentina or Brazil or Mexico. It has recently reduced significantly taxes on shale gas and shale oil. The tax reduction on shale gas was yesterday. And they are looking, as from a fiscal perspective, as hospitable a place to invest as the U.S. and Canada are. So it's not insignificant. Aside from the tax issue and the attraction of capital, there are some things that are unique about the U.S. that are hard to replicate. One is the abundance of water, which will be a challenge in Mexico. But the three most important ones are the number of independent companies that are the entrepreneurs who actually are responsible for the shale revolution. There are companies like this in Colombia and in Argentina, not in Mexico yet. You need entrepreneurial capacity to get this work. You need a financial services sector that is able to finance the risk involved. US and Canada, Australia, the UK have it. Whether this can be exported to Latin America, as it has successfully been to Colombia, is an open question. But finally, the big challenge is the ownership of land resources. Mineral rights are owned by individuals in the US. They're not owned by individuals anywhere else in the world. Canada has created a fiscal regime that replicates land ownership and solves that problem, but it is a very big challenge. And you want to get the landowner to get involved in the benefits of the production, and I think that will be another stumbling block. So I tried to answer most of your questions, and I'm happy to address other ones later. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Well, our next speaker is Rajat M. He was the managing director of the Asian Development Bank from the year 2006 to 2014. Great. He has a banker. He has been related to the themes of energy. I want to ask you this question. Sometimes we hear that there are a lot of problems, a lot of environmental problems with the energy matrix in Asia, that the energy mix, because the enormous importance of coal, is dirty. Well, in Latin America, we are facing some similar problems. We have very little nuclear energy, and the development of hydroelectricity, at least the great dams, they are under siege in a kind of a stalemate. That means that there are a lot of countries, for example, Chile in South America, and at least 3 of the 6 countries in Central America, in which the use of coal and diesel for producing electricity is growing pretty fast. That means that our energy matrix is becoming more dirty. Mr. Neg, you as a banker in Asia can tell us about the way in which some Asian countries are dealing with the challenge of creating a more green and clean energy matrix? There are some things, good practices in this area that we in Latin America must learn?
Thank you. Of all the questions you could have asked me, you've asked me the most difficult and the most embarrassing. Of course, here we are. But since you have asked me, I have to, of course, give you a very honest answer. Just some numbers to put it in context, which confirms the challenge that you mentioned, Mr. Chairman. The world energy demand is expected to grow by 40% over the next 20 years, roughly. And of that, India and China will account for half that growth. And China would account for 27% of the global demand by 2035. So we're talking about huge numbers. India not quite there, but follows that similar trend. And in terms of the energy mix that you mentioned, if in China, it's now about 69%, about 70% is from coal. It'll come down in the next 20 years, but will come down to 52%, so more than half of the coal electric generation, energy generation will be coal-based. In India, it's actually going to be even higher. So Asia, I think, faces a huge environment challenge. And by 2035, China will account for more than 30% of the global gas emission, greenhouse gas emissions. So our environment footprint, even on a per capita basis, and that's a very important one, is going to be very significant. So the challenge that you've mentioned about dirty growth is something that Asia has to contend with. A couple of years back, we did a study jointly with the Emerging Markets Forum and Centennial Group, the founder of which is sitting here, Mr. Kohli. And we said, if the world continues on a business as usual on climate change, of which greenhouse gas emissions, of which coal is obviously a major culprit, by 2100, by the year 2100, the sea rise average would be 46 centimeters, and 6 of the 10 cities which will basically get submerged will be in Asia. Dhaka, of course, in Maldives, Bangkok, and many others. So the challenge you're talking about occupies us a lot. Unfortunately, I don't think we've done enough. But let me tell you what we're trying to do. First of all, I think we have to recognize that the answer, which will not be acceptable in a continent which has 2/3 of the world's poor, is to say lower growth. But I think what we'll have to do is get clean growth or green growth. Lowering growth, I don't think, is an answer. But if lowering growth is not an answer, then the first thing in the public policy arena, which we're having great difficulty with, as I'm sure you are in Latin America, is adequate carbon pricing. And what I find extremely challenging, frustrating, but unavoidable, is to somehow feel that, oh, we're a poor country, we're a poor continent, we can't afford the luxury of green growth. And my answer always has been that you not only must afford the luxury of green growth, that's the only way, otherwise, as I mentioned, 6 of the 10 cities which will be submerged will be in Asia. So carbon pricing is a very important issue, and we've had mixed success. But the good thing is that I think in India and China and many other countries, but certainly India and China, it is not a question of if but how. So people aren't saying, policymakers don't question us now when we talk about carbon pricing. They basically tell us how to do it, how to manage the fiscal regime, how to do the affordability. So there's a whole issue on public policy on pricing, which I think we need to recognize, and I'm sure that applies very much to Latin America. Second is, and it applies to Latin America even more, since you have the largest hydropower resources in the world, we can't just sort of say we won't develop that. because it has problems, and problems are very genuine. I mean, I'm not at all underestimating the problems of hydropower generation. I've been involved in some of the largest hydropower projects in Asia, Namthun 2 in Laos, the whole issue of reservoir flooding, the whole issue of resettlement, whole issue of affected people, particularly indigenous people. But I think what it requires is a civil society, government, affected people discussion on how to provide a fair and just compensation. But not doing a hydropower project, I think, has very, very high costs, which I think the world, including Asia, has somehow pretended doesn't exist by not building hydropower dams for 10, 20 years. And I think in Asia, certainly, and we were the first ones to come back with some hydropower projects. But it's very difficult because the immediate impacts on people are negative. But I don't think there is any choice, because renewables at a global level by 2035 will still be only about 7%, up from about 2 now. So renewables won't go very far, but it has to play a role: solar, geothermal, biomass, and hydro. And I think there, again, it goes back to the point I made earlier, adequate pricing, adequate carbon pricing, which we'll have to do. And a third element is greater regional integration. And I was very pleased to hear in the previous panel we talk about it, because in Latin America, as in Asia, the resources are very unevenly distributed. And we have to have a regional integration of the energy market, of the electric grid, so that you can generate where it's cheaper, get economies of scale, and move it elsewhere, rather than generating at the market, where sometimes it's much more costly, particularly in terms of environment. So public policy, looking at renewables in a very dispassionate way, and looking at the costs and benefits, including that of hydro, and the issue of regional integration are the 3 things that we're doing. We are far from successful, but what I'm happy about is that in Asia, we at least are not debating anymore whether this is a challenge. It is a challenge, it's a question of how rather than if. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that the time is over. I want to say thanks to this very outstanding group of panelists, to Bill Richardson, to Adam Sieminski, Mauricio Tolmasquim, Rajat M, Ed Morse, and Francisco Monaldi. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share your views. Thank you.